way you have it, just in case there's problems with audio. Okay, so before we start talking about theories of grief, I want to just touch down. I did not post, as many of you already know, the mini media presentation schedule. I'm going to put that up as soon as we get off the phone here. And so I will put that up. And then you can sign up for that. I'll see if I can maybe even make a little doodle poll so that you can sign up for a time and everybody can see what spaces are available. So I'll do that this afternoon. Let's see here. There was a couple questions about the culture chart. I don't care where you post that as long as it's in that discussion thread. So if you went in and said, ooh, I really want this particular culture or religion, you can post it back under that again, or just make a new post. That's fine. New thread. That's not a problem at all. The goal is that as long as it's in that thread, in that forum, rather, I should say, then everybody will be able to see them and print them off and have a really nice resource. So however you want to do that, anything that you post in the discussions, when I go in to grade it, automatically comes up under your name. So it doesn't matter where you post it. Okay. All right. Good, good. Let's see here. I want to make sure when I have it on share my screen, I can't see your little chat box here. So I'll periodically go back to that. If you do have a question that pertains to me and you want to ask it, just take yourself off the mute and just say it. That way I don't have to worry about that. Okay. All right. So hopefully everybody's with me. Looks like we've got 24 people online. So that's quorum. We're going to go for it. And we're going to talk about theories of grief today. So when we talk about theories, these, again, just like in your paradigms or advanced clinical class that you had before, there's always theories about how to understand what's going on in the process of grief. And these theories help guide us to know if we need to be concerned, what might be some factors that might warrant us getting somebody into some sort of grief therapy or grief counseling early, and just to kind of understand the process. The problem that occurs with grief is that oftentimes there's such a wide array of symptoms that people may have, all of which kind of fall into the spectrum of normal. Because everybody's different, which we've talked about before. So it's really hard to develop some theories that really give us the whole spectrum of what could be possible in grief. So we're going to start off and we're going to talk about sort of in historic order, theories of grief. And so the first piece of this is to really talk a little bit about Kubler-Ross. There we go. And now, remember when we're talking about these theories is that they each build on each other, much like just psychological theory in general, is that as we progress through history, we can see that things build on each other. So Kubler-Ross is sort of the founder, if you will. She laid the foundation for us to have a conversation about death and dying, and what that looks like and how best to help people through the dying process. So, she was a physician. Let's see here. Getting a little bit of background noise there. Okay. She was a physician who was, there's a great movie, it's on the syllabus, called Facing Death, and it's all about Kubler-Ross. You don't have to watch it. Sometimes we have extra time, we'll watch it in class. That's not going to happen this time, but they have it at a local library. I think they have it on Amazon as well. Just a really good documentary about Kubler-Ross. But she was a physician. And hold on, I'm going to see if I can eliminate the background. Where is it coming from? Okay. So she, oh, my pointer won't move. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So she was a physician. She actually came over from Austria, I believe, and came over and she became a physician and she worked at the University of Chicago. And at the University of Chicago, she started doing research because at that time in the 1960s, we did not ever really talk about what would be most helpful to people in the dying process. It was thought of as taboo to ask them what they were experiencing, what was going on with them, how we could help. And Kubler-Ross came in on the scene and said, hey, you know what? We need to start talking about this. We need to start asking how we can make this process better for people. So what she did was a qualitative study. And really, she got her residents together. And as people were in the dying process, she would interview them in front of all of her residents and sort of started doing a qualitative analysis and looking at themes of what's the most helpful and the process, what they experience as they die. So this was really groundbreaking. And then from that information, she wrote a New York bestseller called On Death and Dying. So this was really the first time we started talking about death and what people were experiencing. And as you can imagine, there was a huge amount of resistance in the medical community because it just felt like an intrusion on people's dying process, and also really, again, sort of stood up against this idea that the medical community was always needed to be focused on curing and sort of change the tide, that we needed to be looking more at palliative measures. Of course, they weren't necessarily calling it that at this point. So I'm going to talk about a lot of the critiques of this in a moment, but first let's just talk about, from that research, she came up with 5 stages that people go through in the dying process. And the first one was denial. And this stage of denial is really where people, they may get a diagnosis and think, no, you know what, that they must have mixed up the scans. This can't be happening. I'm perfectly healthy, and just really it had this cognitive dissonance that this can't be happening to me. And that's that first stage when people are first diagnosed. And then following that stage comes this stage of anger, where it sort of flows out of that denial of just being angry that they're going through this. The thought of not being around, not being able to be part of their family or experience milestones of their family, this anger sort of pours out. And so, what I'll say is that although this model has been generalized to many, many different populations, far beyond just people who are dying, but experience of all different types of losses, it's been generalized to lots of populations. There's something to be said for looking at this model. It's become pop culture at this point. But there's something to be said for that, because oftentimes we do see that people are angry in the medical community. Oftentimes patients will be in the hospital and they'll be angry with everyone. They're angry with the nurses, they're angry with the physicians, they yell at their family members. We see that. And if we can conceptualize that as part of this process, and not just that they're mean or something like that, but that this anger is actually part of the process and a very normative part when someone is dying. From the anger stage, we move into this bargaining stage, where this can kind of take on lots of different forms. But one of them is if they believe in a higher power. I promise that I'll do this if you make this illness go away. I didn't pursue what I thought I should. Maybe in my life I got off track, and if I don't die, I'm going to get back on track. And we start seeing some of this bargaining. Sometimes it's not with a higher power. It's just these sort of promises. If I make it through this, this is what I'm going to do. And we start seeing that kind of bargaining as a very real stage of this process. The next stage is depression, and this sort of follows the bargaining of just kind of this feeling that none of that bargaining is helping, this process is happening, and so oftentimes we see a what Kubler-Ross would call a reactive depression, and this reactive depression is in response to the situation. So this isn't necessarily a pathological depression that we would see a clinical major depressive episode, but it's just this sense of depression that, this situation is not changing. I'm going to have to figure out how to deal with it. And just this sort of just feeling very down and experience sort of these sub-threshold depressive symptoms. That is one part of depression, this reactive depression to the situation. Kubler-Ross goes even further to say that sort of transforms as a person progresses through the stages to a depression that is much more just a withdrawal and really on the cusps of acceptance of I need to withdraw from people because I am going to die, and I need to just create this space for myself to be able to go through that process. And so that is much less reactive, but more of a preparation for death. And then this last part is this acceptance. And Kubler-Ross says that people hopefully come to this place of accepting that they are going to die. There's certainly not a joy or anything in that, like people get to acceptance and say, hooray, this is happening. That's not what she was saying. But she was saying that there's more of a calm acceptance that this is going to happen. I've worked through some of the things I need to, and I am in a place that I understand that this is going to happen. And it's a much more peaceful and albeit withdrawn place to come to the acceptance of what's going on with them. Okay, so I'm going to check this chat real quick. Oops. Maybe I am. Okay. All right, good. There. Okay, so
Professor Maxfield.
Yeah.
This is Jessica. I just have a question about the stage theory. So is there I don't want to say a time frame that this happens in, but I guess, but that is what I'm saying. So how?
No, it's a great question, and there really isn't a time frame. Most of these theories don't put too much of a time frame on it because everybody's so different. The thing about this is that it was geared toward people who were dying. It is not geared to, and this is one of the critiques of this theory, is that it wasn't geared towards people who are grieving the loss of someone who has died. It magically made that transition, and you'll see that people apply stage theory to bereavement all the time. But originally, and when she did her research, it was just focused on people who were dying. And so because of that, the time frame, there really wasn't one, because the time frame for people dying, we could be talking about someone who was diagnosed and then had 3 years of remission in between and things like that, or we could talk about someone who was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer and dead within a month and a half. So but people walk through this process regardless of their sort of trajectory and time frame.
I'm sorry, you said that it was originally for people that are dying, not for people that are experiencing losing someone or going through a divorce, etc. But now we use this same stage of grief for all those things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you say we, Jessica, that's a really good point, is that we as social work researchers should not, but as a general society, because this has become pop culture, people apply this to everything. They apply it to losing a job, losing a house, losing, certainly losing a loved one, losing sort of the ideal of a dream. We apply this stage theory as a society all over the place, when really it had nothing, like the research never was for any of those other populations. Now, has there been some research to support that now? A little bit. Not so much, not a lot, not enough to warrant the general application that we use for this. So I'm going to stop for 1 second, and we're going to talk. Oh, hold on, I wanted to pull something up. I meant to do it earlier. Whoop. Hang on, I'm going to move this around. Hold that thought. Again, if you look at pretty much like every cartoon known to man, they have done something on Kubler-Ross. Because it's pop culture. So I'm going to play, this is just an example of pop culture. I apologize because there's a couple bad words in there, but this is sort of demonstrates kind of how we have accepted the stage theory. And, hold on a second. They even still teach stage theory to medical students as being like the #1 theory, which we're going to continue to look at, and we'll see that that's really not the case. But here you go. Here's your little morning laugh.
Uh-oh. It's no big deal. It's probably not even quicksand. I'm going to have a good laugh about this tonight with the guys. Well, this is just perfect. Stupid quicksand. Stupid jungle. I want to bite someone in the face. Mother. Ah! That stupid jungle. Are you there, God? It's me, Giraffe. Listen, if you would just give me a mulligan on this quicksand thing, I promise. No more peeing on your shorter creatures. What, you get a deal? You know something? I'm cool with this. I bet heaven has all the tender leaves I can eat, and everyone gets their own Slurpee machine. Yeah, take me, sweet death. I await your loving embrace. What? I think I hit the bottom.
Okay, so I just pressed it again. There we go. Okay, so see, pop culture, people, this really has become pop culture. Whether it's true or not, or whether it's got the research to support it or not, it has. And so we have to be really careful that we don't just look at this one particular theory and say, oh, okay, yeah, that's it. That's the most, up-to-date research. The reality is that there's a lot of critiques of Kubler-Ross because, one, it didn't ever have any quantitative research to support its findings. So interestingly enough, and we know this, you all know this, you've taken research or you're in research now. We start off with some like grounded theory. We do some qualitative research to look at the themes, and then we do quantitative research to look at correlation, right? And so we do that. Well, that never happened with this theory. Kubler-Ross wrote a New York bestseller, okay? And that was taken as sort of because it opened the conversation for something that we'd never talked about before. It was taken as, just the gold standard, when in reality, that's not really what happened. Okay, So what it did that was positive is that it did bring the topic of death and dying into mainstream society. And it was really that first exposure to having conversations about death, which was so out of the ordinary that it resulted in her having a New York's bestseller. It presented a systematic way for people to conceptualize this process. So here's the interesting piece of that, though, is that when you look at those stages, does anybody have any concern with those? Don't forget to take yourself off mute.
I was thinking, this is Molly. I was thinking, could they be in a different order?
Yeah, that's a great point, Molly, is that Kubler-Ross said that these are the stages, right? And so she originally, when she wrote the book, she would say that you have to go through these stages, which implied a very linear perspective that you have to, start with denial and make it through to acceptance. Later on in her work, she did revise that and say, well, they weren't meant to be linear. You can go in and out of these, which is a really interesting point, because imagine it's really hard to get to a place of acceptance if you're in denial that you have a terminal illness. And it's hard to be, in denial and anger at the same time, although that's possible. So she sort of backtracked on that and said that they weren't linear, but the reality is that when you look at the whole structure of this theory, they are very linear, and you really can't talk yourself out of that so much. So although you can come into the process at any point, and some people don't make it to acceptance, the idea is that they would make it through that process. Which brings to another point of critique, is that this model really helps us as clinicians, and maybe even not so much clinicians, but as the medical community, conceptualize what's happening with someone who's dying. Is it helpful to the person who's dying? Probably not. In my own practice, I have people come in all the time, and they have applied this to themselves in their grieving process, and will say, I never experienced anger, so something must be very wrong with me. I'm not going through the stages appropriately. And it becomes a prescription that people say, oh, I have to do it this way. And if I don't do it this way, then something's wrong with me. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm doing this wrong. So it can be more harmful to folks because they feel like they have to go through this. Anyone else?
Hi, it's Ashley Claiborne. Can you hear me?
I can. Go for it, Ashley.
Okay. Kind of to, I guess, piggyback a question off what you said, like, could another critique be that maybe some people don't go through, like, all of them? Like, maybe someone is experiencing, like, depression, like, without denial or anger or acceptance. Like, is it possible to just go through one aspect of the grieving process? Like, some people don't get to go through the whole thing before either they get severely ill and they pass, or they just don't make it to the next stage of, like, emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is another critique, is that some people just don't experience certain parts of this these stages, right? Some people don't ever experience anger. Some people, this is very culturally based, right? And we're learning about that. But think about it, is there are some cultures who from a very early age are talking about death and make it a very normative part of life. And so therefore the anger element is not necessarily there, because they see death as part of the living process. And so they might not experience that. So it really doesn't account for cultural differences that people may experience. right? And again, when we look at, who did we research, right? Most of the people that Kubler-Ross was talking to were, in this case, white females in the dying process. So we have the female perspective, but do we have a diverse group of people that may have different belief systems and different worldviews? Nope, not at all. So that calls into question, are there other emotional responses, right, that people may experience that are not part of these 5 stages, right? People may experience a whole range of emotion, but that does not fit into this theory at all.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm sorry about the chips, guys. I didn't know my mic was on. But is it concerning that someone may have an extended, or is it concerned that someone might experience one of these things for an extended period of time? Does that about concern?
Yeah, so here's what I would say is that, again, I think we get more concerned about people being in a stage for a longer period of time when we're talking about people who have lost someone and are grieving, because then we start talking about complicated grief and things like that. But when we're talking about folks who are dying, right, which is what this theory really is looking at, there's really no time frames for this, so that Kubler-Ross didn't have any time frame to say, oh, you know what, you can be in denial for this long before we consider that pathological, and you can, be in anger for this long, or you should move through that within this time period. She really didn't say that. Not really so helpful, right? Okay. All right. So this really, again, laid the foundation, but some serious research methodology flaws, some concerns about it not being very comprehensive. And the biggest concern is that it just magically jumped from being applied to one population and then applied to bereavement or loss in general, and it really wasn't researched for that. Okay. So if you have a chance to watch that movie, Facing Death, it's a great movie. Kubler-Ross was actually, she was very funny, and interestingly enough, and I think this is probably the kicker of it all, is that when she was dying, she was interviewed, and they wrote an article where she basically denounced her entire theory and said, I'm in the dying process. I didn't experience any of these. It wasn't linear. And my theory was a bunch of bunk. It just had nothing. None of this is true. And this is not what I experienced. And she basically, at the end of her life, denounced the entire theory that she had written her book on. She also, I think part of the issue with why this theory wasn't continued to be developed was that she went in a lot of different directions after she wrote On Death and Dying. And one of the directions is that she actually wanted to start a hospice for children who had HIV and were dying of AIDS. And at that time, that was considered very taboo, and so the community actually burned down the building that she was working to develop this hospice for children with HIV. Shortly after that, she changed directions completely and decided that she was going to become a medium, and started a center to channel and talk with the dead. So in the medical community, she lost a lot of respect when she sort of changed directions. and then didn't continue any of her research. The University of Chicago actually did not renew her contract because they were so upset with her that she was talking with people who were dying, and that was so taboo that they, to this day, they'll say, well, we just didn't need her anymore, so we didn't renew her contract. In the video and the movie, it talks a little bit about how they didn't renew her contract. So, okay, so that's the one theory. It laid the foundations for us. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit. Oh, we already talked about the critiques there.
Can I ask a?
Yep, go ahead.
When you were saying about when she kind of changed her theory, or denounced her theory, to me, could you even say that was like denial of the process? Like, it kind of just makes me think that.
That was part of her denial.
Yeah.
She was dying.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, who knows? She said that she didn't experience anger, and she basically walked through each one of the steps or the stages and said, no, I didn't experience these at all. So interesting. It's an interesting element, just to, here's this theory that we've applied so randomly to so many things, and then the author even is questioning its validity.
I have another question. I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, as social workers, are we kind of using this theory to, help clients through the dying process? Or, if someone's like, oh, I'm angry, are we kind of, normalizing that for them? Or...
Right. So that theory is like I said, it's really focused on helping medical professionals understand as people are dying what they could be experiencing. So we're going to talk about some other theories that Kubler-Ross sort of laid the foundation for further research that are much more researched and probably just much more helpful to us as clinicians, but that we just start with that historic perspective so that we can know where we came from. So I would say that, if someone came in and they're super angry, so I give an example. I worked at Mount Washington Pediatric, and I worked in when they had a very small grant for hospice and palliative care, and we had a baby come in who he was about probably he was probably 6-7 months, maybe 8 months old, with a neurodegenerative disease, and came into our hospice bed, and came in so that he could die in the hospital. And I worked with a family, and every single week I would go in and I would talk with the mom, and they were they were there every day with this baby. And I would talk with her and just provide some emotional support, and we would talk. And then Dad would come in, and he was so angry. And so every time I would go in to see them, he would yell at me, and he would say, I hate you, don't come back. And he would just, scream at me. He would yell at the nurses. And every time he was there, I'd still stop by and say hello to him. And he would scream at me and yell at me. And, just kept trying to forge that relationship to be a support, because he was just angry. And this helped me, right? For what it's worth, Kubler-Ross, understanding that that's just part of his grieving process, as opposed to saying, well, wow, that guy's an asshole, right? I was able to say, okay, you know what? This is part of his process. That's where he's at right now. And I'm not internalizing that as me or anything like that. This is just part of his process. And so I continued on. The baby was there for about 6 months, and this happened every week. I would go in and talk with his wife and provide support. He would get there, he'd scream at me. And finally the baby died. And when I went in right after the baby had died and they were still in the room, he gave me a big hug, and he was just like, I guess you're going to be happy because next week you're going to come in and you're not going to have to deal with me anymore. Right. And I just sat with them, and I ended up going to the funeral, which, you know, is something else we can talk about. But as a clinician, you know, how often do we go to the funeral? Do you not? In this case, I did. And when I got there, he just, all the anger sort of left. And he gave me a hug and just held on to me, probably for like 5 minutes, and just cried and cried and cried and said, you know, you were so consistent coming in and seeing me. Like, even though I was yelling at you every week, I so appreciate that you kept coming back. And that meant so much to me. And it helped him through that process, even though it was a horrible, horrible process. But this theory helped me to sort of conceptualize what was going on with him, as opposed to me being frustrated or being like, well, I'm not going to be treated that way. Right? Just knowing that that was part of the process, and that was part of his grieving process. Jessica, does that help at all?
Yes, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. But that being said, is it the most helpful theory to clinicians? Probably not. So here's, we're going to move on to talk about Worden and the tasks of mourning. So Worden moved away from this idea of stages that Kubler-Ross had and moved into tasks, meaning that when we are, now again, when we are in the grieving process, there's kind of comparing apples and oranges here, because Kubler-Ross again was directed towards when people were dying, and Worden is focused on the bereavement process. But that through the bereavement process, we have 4 tasks that we need to accomplish in order to sort of work through this grieving process successfully. So the first one is to come to the reality of the loss, right? So this is interesting, and I think there's another slide later on where we compare all of these theories. But when we start thinking about that as kind of where Kubler-Ross ends up, right, at acceptance, is a little bit where Worden picks up and says, you know, the first thing that we have to do is come to a reality of the loss and understand that there's this that we have this loss, and that seems like sometimes it can be an easier process, but there's so many pieces that can complicate just coming to the reality of the loss. And so there's this also, just to keep in mind when we're talking about the reality of the loss, we're not just talking about physically the reality of the loss, although that is very much part of this. Worden will talk about mediators of mourning, and oftentimes when someone's in the military and a body isn't recovered, or there's some sort of mass tragedy and a body's not recovered, it impacts this stage or this task of being able to accept the reality of the loss, because there's this thought or belief that maybe this is just completely wrong. Maybe my loved one is still alive. Maybe they got out, or maybe they are hiding somewhere, they're in the military, you know. So there's a lot of ambivalence in this stage at times, or ambiguity in this stage. But it's not just about the physical. It's also about sort of the emotional piece as well, of just what does this loss mean for me? What does that look like as far as the emotional elements of accepting the reality that this person's not coming back, that I'm no longer, you know, at this point in time, a wife, or that although I'm a mother, my role as a mom has been taken away. So there's a lot of accepting of the reality of the loss that is based in emotional pieces as well. There's the intellectual piece and the emotional. The second stage is to process the pain of grief. And this one is probably hands down the one that most people come into your office and say, yeah, I don't want to do that, right? Because nobody wants to sit with the pain of grief. This is the task that we often try to just skip over. I want this to be done. I don't have time to process that grief. I just need to move on with my life. And so this is where people oftentimes sort of get stuck because they work really hard at avoiding the pain of grief, because no one wants to sign up for pain, right? No one wants to sort of sit with that. And I shouldn't say no one, but most of the time, these are the folks that are coming into therapy because they really just don't want to process that pain. They don't want to deal with the pain of the loss that they've experienced. The next stage, after they've sort of processed the pain of grief, is to adjust to a world without the deceased. And so this is very much about very concrete adjustments. This is where, if you read in the Wharton textbook, people are, adjusting to learning how to pay bills because they've never done that because maybe their spouse did it, or they are adjusting to their role being different as far as, I'm not a mom anymore. So, what does that sort of look like for me without this person here anymore? This can take very concrete, like I mentioned, roles of paying bills, going on vacation, those kinds of things. And it also is a very emotional, more even at times a spiritual, and Warden will talk about the spiritual adjustment as well, that people have to sort of adjust to as they adjust to the world without their loved one, and that this their life has changed. The trajectory of what they thought it was going to look like has changed. Okay, so if you hear a little person, there's my background noise. No school, hooray. Okay, the last piece of this is finding a connection with the deceased. So this is really interesting because we really moved away from theories that say, like, Freud would have said that you have to, like, cut off all emotional connection so that you can have the energy to invest in new relationships. Warden takes this and says, no, that's not how it works at all, is that you need to find a lasting connection with the person that you've lost. And so sometimes those are things like funeral rituals and those types of things. But sometimes these are things that, there's such a variety of ways that people can feel connected. Sometimes it's keeping something with them that reminds them of the person. Sometimes it's on the anniversary of the death, or on their birthday, or something like that, having some sort of ritual to maintain the connection with the person that they've lost. Oftentimes, this is a lot of what we do in therapy, is work with people. I mean, work in all of these stages, but also help people to be able to find something that they feel connected. I worked with a lady just recently who had lost her dad, and she was very close to her dad. And at Thanksgiving, she was really ready. She had worked through a lot of the pain of the loss, and sort of adjusting. She was still working on adjusting to not having him there. But to find the connection, she really wanted to feel connected with her dad at Thanksgiving, even though he had died. And so his favorite thing was meatballs. Like, he was Italian. His favorite thing was meatballs. And her family, she felt, was really not at a place yet. They were still very much in the pain of the grief. So they weren't at a place to sort of have some kind of ritual at Thanksgiving to acknowledge his loss. So instead, what she did was, as part of Thanksgiving dinner, instead of just having the traditional turkey and all of that, she made meatballs because it provided her a connection, and it was something that she could do that was subtle enough that it wasn't going to, she felt like, upset the rest of her family, who were very much still in the pain of the grief, but it made her feel connected with her dad in that process. So just a small example of finding ways to be connected with the person you've lost. Okay, questions about these tasks of mourning? So the thing that's interesting about Warden, and you'll find that in most hospice and palliative care, if you're following people after the loss in palliative care, but in hospice, this is really what the theory that's used for understanding grief. And maybe that's because it's very helpful to the clinician, right? I can look and I can say, okay, look, I can see what task they're struggling with. And if they're struggling to process the pain of grief, then I can help work on that. We can start talking about the history that they had with the person who died. We can start unpacking their relationship so that we can kind of process that pain and what happened. If they're having trouble with adjusting to the world without the deceased, we can talk about the different role that that person played and their role when that person was alive, and start working towards implementing different ways to adjust and different roles that they're taking on and tasks and concrete things that they need to do and process their anxiety about that. If they're needing to find connection with the person that they've lost, we can talk about rituals. I had an older lady who really felt very disenfranchised in her grief because she was divorced, but her husband, her ex-husband, had died. And so she felt like she wasn't allowed to grieve that loss because they were divorced. And so we talked about a way for her to find a connection and sort of process that pain, but then also find a connection with him. And apparently he had been a huge sailor. He loved to sail, and that was something that they used to enjoy doing together before they got divorced. And so she made a paper sailboat and was able to go to this marina and just like let it go and just spend some time reflecting on both the good and the bad of their relationship and process her grief that way, and feel that connection. So there are ways that we can implement and help people that are very unique to their situation and their relationship, but that they can find that connection. So this is a theory that really helps us as a clinician. Are we telling the client when they come in and they're like, hey, hey, I think you're in the task of processing the pain of grief, so we need to work on that? No, of course not. But this is really helpful for me as a clinician to sort of outline where the person is. So before I flip to the next slide, does anybody have any concerns or critiques about this theory?
I don't have a critique, but I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I know you said that you're not going to basically assess the person and be like, oh, they're at this stage of the theory. However, how do you know when to help? Is it the client asking, or is it just your clinical judgment saying, I feel that this will be beneficial to the client at this point of their grieving? Because
Yeah.
Personally, I went through this process, and the social worker was very helpful, but he helped more on the macro side of things and not clinical. So I'm just wondering, like, how do clinicians decide what assistance a family may need or want?
Yeah. So part of our assessment, if we're using this theory, is to figure out where they are, what task they're sort of either stuck in or have avoided. If it's the process of processing the pain, oftentimes folks will sort of avoid that at all costs. So part of our assessment is to see kind of where they're at. And oftentimes when people come in, just by the language that they use, you'll be able to tell where they're at. I've had, a mom come in who lost her daughter from an overdose, and she and her husband came in. Her husband was very much in sort of adjusting to the world without the deceased. Like he was ready to be like, okay, we've lost our daughter. Like, how is that going to impact our relationship? How are we going to continue on in, our church relationships and he was ready to sort of figure out how to adjust. She, on the other hand, was really at a place of just accepting the reality of the loss. Like she would come in and say, no, I can't believe this has happened. Like, this is just a bad dream. I feel like I'm going to wake up from this bad dream and she's going to be there. And so that sort of was what clued me into the fact that she was really sort of in the emotional place of trying to accept the reality of the loss, which then flowed very quickly into sort of just processing the grief and the pain of that grief. So this isn't, again, something that I'm going to sit down and be like, well, I think you're really trying to adjust, but your wife is sort of in the throes of the pain. That's something that I'm going to assess by the way that they're talking and the stories they're telling and the symptoms they're experiencing, that I'm going to get that idea and be able to assess where they're at and then be able to intervene based on what task they're in. In the Warden textbook, it's a great textbook. I think thought I had it. Yes, I do. The purple textbook. Here, it's on my shelf. And it doesn't matter which one you have, which version you have, but this textbook, it literally has, here's the task and here are some activities and things that you can do to try to help people who maybe are stuck in each one of those tasks. So that's one of the reasons why I said this is like a great book to have on your bookshelf.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Is it helpful for people to know what task or like what stage they might be in? Like, would that be comforting to know that it's normal, or is it not always helpful to say, oh, you're experiencing anger? Because for a lot of times in grief, it's not okay to be angry with the person or the disease or their higher power.
Yeah. So I think you bring up a really good point, and I think that it depends on each person, right? So I wish there was like one flat correct answer for that. I don't know that there is. The thing about Warden, and I think probably one of the reasons why we like it so much as clinicians, it's very doing oriented. Okay, so you're kind of stuck in this process of processing the pain of grief. Here are some things you can do to work through that. And we as a Western society, we don't like to be, right? We like to do. And that's the global we, but we, like we want to do. And so for some people who are doers, it might be really helpful for them to say, okay, so this is one of the things that I have to do, and I'm sort of in this stage or in this task right now. And that might be really helpful to them. For other folks, they might just not even care about that, and that wouldn't be helpful. I don't know that it would be harmful at all, but they might not need to have, understand the task that they're in or the stage that they might be in. So it really depends on the person. That being said, one of the things that is so important in grief therapy, regardless of what theory you're using, is this idea of universalizing symptoms and normalizing symptoms. So everybody's so different and they experience loss differently. But yes, it is very helpful for people to oftentimes, you say, like, you're angry. Like, I can tell you that you're angry. And you know what? That's a normal response. People who sometimes are, come into my office and say, I feel like I'm going crazy because I can hear my loved one. Like, I'll be sitting in the bedroom and all of a sudden I'll hear them, or I'll think that, I heard them come in or something like that. Am I going crazy? I'm having hallucinations. Well, no. Again, in the presence of grief, that's a very normal response. So it might help to universalize that and normalize that response, that what they're experiencing, so that they know that they're not going crazy, whatever that means, but that's a normal response to grief. Is that helpful? Answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit of the critiques of Warden. So here's an interesting piece to this, is that one of the critiques is that now we've got tasks. We've moved from Kubler-Ross's stages, and now we're talking about tasks. Well, yeah, that's pretty linear yet again, right? You can't really accept the reality of the loss. And at the same time, like if you haven't done that, it's hard to work through the pain of the loss. So Warden 2 will say, well, it's not really linear, but you kind of have to go through these stages or these tasks in order. So, it's kind of linear. So that, again, is a huge critique of this model. So we're gonna see when we get to the next one that sort of goes out the window completely, because we have these two theories that will say, well, you can go in and out, but they're also very linear. Warden, although he provides these ideas for things that sort of impact the grieving process, he calls them mediators of mourning, and looks at a lot of different factors that would impact somebody's grieving process, whether or not the grief is more complicated or more normative. It doesn't really account for specific cultural differences. So although culture is one of the mediators of mourning, again, this idea that we have to walk through each one of these tasks in order to negotiate this process doesn't really lend itself to a lot of cultural differences. The other really interesting piece here is this idea about children. Can we apply these tasks to children? And that becomes challenging, right? Especially when we start talking about the first task of accepting the reality of the loss. Well, children don't necessarily have that capacity because of their cognitive ability to understand permanence and sort of understand reality. Makes it really, really challenging for them to just even hit that first task. So maybe this theory is helpful for children at some level that have the cognitive ability to understand permanence. Maybe not. So something that's definitely a critique of wardens.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's Ashley Claiborne. Pertaining to children, what age do children kind of develop the capacity to understand it? I work for crisis response of Baltimore County, and we're working with 2 children who witnessed their brother's death by suicide. He hung himself and they witnessed it. And my supervisor was saying that the 5-year-old wasn't appropriate for our therapy services because kind of like what you're saying, like that at that age, he can't really grasp the concept of like the permanence of death. And I just wanted to know if there was an age.
Yeah. So we're going to talk more about grief in children as we move along in the next coming up weeks, and we'll go through sort of all of that. But it's in general, usually it's around 6 or 7 that we start to see that kids can really conceptualize and understand permanence. So even at that age, oftentimes they'll ask questions over and over again and they'll seem like they get it, but then they don't, and they ask questions again about it. But in general, we start to see 6, 7, right around that age, that they start to be able to understand permanence and really understand the loss. That being said, I would say that even at younger ages, we can implement things to help them, particularly help their parents be able to help their children cope with loss, even if they can't understand permanence. So there's a lot of interventions as social workers that we can do with the parents so that the kids that are younger can, sort of process their grief that in a way that is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so another just critique of Warden is just that idea that what positive coping looks like, right? We're hoping that people aren't getting into complicated grief, but sometimes the line of what could be complicated and what is normative grief can get a little blurred. Certainly when we see things that are the outliers and extremes, then that's different. But sometimes, one person's grief response might be very adaptive for them, and for someone else that same response might not be. So it's challenging in this sense to sort of nail down like what is positive coping in the light of the loss. Certainly we want to look at functioning and how people are functioning, but Warden is somewhat vague in what he says is positive. Is it being able to satisfy all of those tasks? Maybe they, in a way that we would say is positive coping. So things get a little vague there. Okay, so I'm actually gonna, I think, skip over the mediators of mourning just for right now, because I want to wrap up the other theory for you, and then we'll either circle back, or I believe next week we're talking about mediators of mourning as well and wrapping up theory. So we're gonna come back to that. So the last theory that we're going to talk about is called the dual process model. And this model is probably it's one of the newest models of grief. And it sort of abandons this whole idea of stages or tasks and really looks at grief as a continuous process that doesn't have an ending of acceptance in any way. It really says that grief is something that once you're sort of in the grief cycle because you've experienced a loss, you're there for forever. And that can be comforting for some and frustrating for others. But it's just this idea that we move back and forth between loss orientation on one side and restoration orientation on the other side once we've experienced a loss. So I think I've got, oh, I don't have my beautiful little picture. Let me get you one real quick because I wanted you to see that. Hold on. Move this down. I'd like to show you the little diagram. There we go. Okay, make that bigger for you. There you go. Hopefully you guys can see that. Yeah. Okay, so what dual process suggests is that once we've experienced a loss, there's sort of these two circles, if you will, that we're in. On the one side, it's this loss orientation. And the loss orientated portion of this is really where we're doing the emotional piece, oftentimes, of the grief work. So this is where we're experiencing the intense pain, the sometimes there's like the denial and avoidance of our emotional responses. Like all of the stuff that normally we think of, and it's interesting because we think of this as oftentimes the emotional responses, which it doesn't necessarily have to be. That's very much rooted in our sort of thinking about how some people grieve in a very emotive way and some people grieve in a very sort of task-oriented way, and we're going to talk more about that, grieving styles, in the coming weeks as well. But both of those can be loss-oriented, where we're really focused in on making it through managing the grief, okay? On the flip side of that is restoration orientation. And this is really where we're focusing on like what needs to happen. I need to go to work. I need to get up. I need to go to the grocery store. I need to pay my bills. I need to sort of just function at a basic level. And these are all things that that are impacted by our grieving, but that are more focused on just like our normative functioning. So sometimes it's where you need to take on new roles, sometimes it's new relationships, sometimes it's just basic distractions from our grieving process. And what happens is that once someone comes into this grieving process, is that they move back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation. And the real healing, if you will, in the grieving process is the ability to move fluidly or oscillate back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation. So, so this back and forth movement and being able to move back and forth is really where we start to be able to function better, and we are moving through the grieving process. The interesting piece about this, which is really, I think, very helpful for us as clinicians and for people just in general who are, are familiar with this, is that oftentimes people will come in and they'll say, I feel like I'm going crazy because I might wake up in the morning and just feel like I have no energy. I can't get out of bed. I can't function. I'm crying hysterically. I can't even take a shower. And, I'm really just so struggling with the pain of this loss. And then a friend might call and I might go out to the movies and I'll laugh and have a great time. And then I think, oh my goodness, like I can't believe that, 2 hours ago I was in a fetal position crying and now I'm out laughing and having fun. And then I get home and I'm back to this, really struggling again. And I feel like I'm going crazy. Well, that's the way grief works. And when we look at it from this model, we see that, being able to flow back and forth is okay. And it's actually ideal. That's what we want people to be able to do, is that they're not just in loss orientation, because then they can't function. And they're not just in restoration orientation, because then a lot of times they are avoiding the pain of the loss. To use terms from Warden, right? So it's really in this being able to flow back and forth. And there's no end point. There's no, okay, you managed your grief, which is really important, particularly because, let's be honest, that's the way it is that once we've experienced a loss, you are never out of the grieving cycle. The intensity of the grief response may very well change. But you're never out of it. I oftentimes will tell the story of my father, who he lost his dad when he was 12. And he sort of manned up and led his household at 12 and became a parent to really help out with the other children and all of those things. And so he never really grieved. Warden might have said that he had some kind of complicated grief, but he was very functional, had children, got married, did all of those things. And I remember going to the movies when I was like 13 or 14 with him, and we saw this movie, and it was about a gentleman who had lost his dad. And it was a really cute movie, very heartwarming, but my dad had a really intense emotional reaction. So when the movie ended, he was still sitting in the seat crying, and my mom and I just kind of looked at him like, oh, okay. And so we waited, and like 10 minutes went by, and he was still in the seat after the movie, like the credits had ended, and he was still sobbing. And we just kind of sat there. I remember sitting in the theater for like 35 minutes after the credits had ended, just sitting there, because he was having this really intense emotional reaction. He had moved back over into loss orientation and was having this emotional reaction where he just needed to kind of be with that. And then after that, moved right back over to restoration. But he was able to move back and forth between that. And we're talking about like 35 years later. And that's really what happens in grief, is that we have these moments where we move back over into loss orientation. Sometimes it's at like milestones or achievements and things like that. And then we move back over to restoration. And this kind of takes all of those tasks and stages out and just says, hey, guess what? Once you've experienced a loss, this is what's going to happen. And intensity and the staying in one versus the other of these orientations is going to fluctuate as we continue on. So the other piece of this is that the research that has been done and to develop this theory is very much based on widows and widowers. And so as we're talking about how men and women grieve differently, we're going to see this come up again because we're going to talk about grieving styles. And there are certain grieving styles that are just much more intuitive, and they are very in touch with their emotions and really sort of hover in looking at the pain of their grief, where there are task-oriented folks as well who, that's a grieving style, who are much more doers of things. And so the goal here in the research has been, like, if you are a task-oriented person, then maybe in therapy we need to help you touch down on the more intuitive part of grief. And if you're a really intuitive griever, maybe we need to help you move over into more of the task-oriented stuff so that you can oscillate back and forth and not be stuck in one side or the other. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so does that make sense?
This is Nicole. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
This model sounds pretty similar to Warden's fourth task. Is that an accurate comparison? The finding a connection with the deceased while forming a new life.
Yeah. So what I would say is that I think that in the restoration and in loss orientation, there's an element of both of that, finding that connection. In the loss orientation, sort of coming to a place of understanding how that loss impacts you, and then also how you can build that connection so that you can still have that person sort of tangibly in your life somehow. And in restoration, taking on new roles and sort of this post-grief or post-loss, I should say, growth that we see in being able to expand your role and things like that. So yeah, I do think that they're in that fourth task of Wardens, that both of these different orientations can represent that. I would say that I think that in the dual process model, it doesn't lend itself to just one task at all. It's sort of all encompassing, and certainly the second task of the pain of grief is squarely in loss orientation. There's no way around that, but processing that pain, and also the sort of acceptance of the loss is very much in loss orientation. Although when we start talking about functionality and roles and things like that, you can see it in the restoration a little bit too. How does that makes it clear as mud, right?
Thank you.
The nice thing about this model is that it is so fluid, that instead of trying to move people through a process so that they can come out on the other side and then be an acceptance, or certainly we want people to feel connected to the person that they've lost in some way and have that lasting connection, but this allows people to go back and forth as they need. Okay, so here's a little comparison, and again, I'll put this up there on in the announcements as well, so that you have this one. But when we look, Warden really accepts the reality of the loss. That's very much like accepting the reality of the world, how it's changed. Your world's changed. And that's really in that loss orientation of being able to understand that part. Warden says we need to experience the pain of grief. In dual process, there are periods of respite from the pain, right? Really, when we oscillate over into the more restorative orientation, those are periods of respite from dealing with the pain. And so you don't, there's this sense that then you can flow back and forth, and you don't just have to be processing pain. There can be windows where you take a break from that, right? And when we talk about like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Don't we talk about dosing? That's something that I do with patients all the time, is helping them dose their pain from a loss. Like, it's okay for you to take 20 minutes and laugh. It's okay for you to go out to dinner and enjoy being with friends, even in the process of processing the pain of grief. So it gives them the respite to be able to move in and out of that. In adjusting to the world without the deceased, that's very much like the restoration and reconstructing their environment, taking on new roles. That, again, that idea of post-loss growth that people can experience, and hopefully that's what they are experiencing as they move forward. And then relocating the deceased from Warden is really much, very much about taking on new roles, new identities, engaging in relationships and things like that, which we'll see in the restoration orientation.
Is there a period in the Strobe and Shoot model where like you can get stuck? Like, say if a person like wasn't processing, but like in an extremely happy mood, like just lost their husband and like very cheerful, and like, is there like a maladaptive like approach to that? Like, can you be stuck on one extreme?
Yes, that's a great question, Ashley. So here's the thing, is that the healing process in the dual process model is the oscillation between the two. So really, we don't want anyone to stay all in restoration or all in the loss orientation. We want the oscillation between the two. So when you have someone who's, say, just in loss orientation, and that's all they're doing, and they can't oscillate, they're stuck, and that's all they can do, then that's really good information for us, because then we can help them be able to move over. That's like the dosing piece. When I have someone comes in who's just in loss orientation, we're going to work on, hey, could you allow yourself a little break from focusing on this pain to connect with a friend? And even though it feels awkward and you don't feel like doing it, let's see if we can just allow yourself 15 minutes to do that. And we'll dose that to try to get them to swing over into restoration just a little bit. If we have someone who's all in restoration, and you'll find these folks who are so task oriented, it's not about they can't touch down with the pain of the loss or any of the loss orientation, and so they are, I've had folks who are, they're selling grandma's house, they're packing up her stuff, they're doing all these things, they're volunteering, they're all things that have to get done, but they're not allowing any breathing space for them to sort of deal with the pain of the loss, because they're so task oriented. And so with those folks, we'll take the opposite approach, and we'll try to help them move over and oscillate into just being with what it means for them to have experienced this loss, the pain that they're feeling. So that's really what we're trying to do in this model, is help people be able to fluidly go back and forth, as opposed to be stuck in one or the other. Now, so I know the next question comes up is, what's the time frame, right? How long is too long to be in the loss orientated or the restoration? Well, there's really not a good answer to that. It's more of if we're seeing people not functioning well, and they're so in one or the other that we know we need to start helping move them back and forth. Is that helpful?
Very much so. Thank you.
Okay. So the benefits of the dual process model is one is that we just step right outside of any linear model. Like this is so not linear. This is like the zigzag in the oscillation, which is really where the healing happens. But the benefit is that, again, the research that's been done on this has very much focused on gender differences and grieving style differences. So it really does explain genders and can help with that. And it can really incorporate cultural differences because, again, some cultures say, look, you got to be in loss orientation for a specific amount of time. And so it can explain that. That's okay. So maybe it is for the first 6 months or the first year or 8 months, you have to be in this loss orientation. And that's really where the focus is. And so that wouldn't be seen as pathological in any way because that's really what the culture would call for before we start oscillating back and forth. Some cultures don't allow that, so then they would be more in restoration. So this back and forth can really incorporate cultural differences in a way that the others really didn't address. Okay. All right, is everyone still with me? Do you have any questions about all that? I know I just usually we do this in a debate, so it's not just me talking randomly for an hour and a half about theory, but questions about any of those?
Question. And this is like happening right now with my family, where my dad is my grandpa passed away in November, so my dad is kind of like taking this task role for my grandma, and it's like a really it's like weighing heavily on him where he sometimes will tell me like he can't even really grieve his dad right now. Mm-hmm. So I wonder like how to help if like there still needs to be the structure for my grandma kind of because it's still so early, but then how to like help my dad where he can still have that like emotional orientation.
Yeah. So things that help sort of move people into that emotional orientation, because there are always things that have to be done, particularly, and maybe not in your case right now, but right after someone dies, there's so many things that have to be taken care of. And depending on, the person's assets and all of those things, there's so many just concrete things that have to happen. That being said, those things can continue to happen, but helping the person just be able to, one of the things that I oftentimes will do is, let's just do some, just recollections of who that person meant to you. So bring in a couple pictures of that person and let's start just like developing who they were and what role they played in your life. And even in just that, oftentimes that'll help people to sort of recognize the impact of the loss and sort of talk through that and be able to understand the importance of that person. Other things sometimes, and again, like we borrow from Warden, even in the dual process model, but what can you do to have a lasting connection with that person? Because that is loss orientation, moving them to being able to do that. Like, what is it that they could do? I had a gentleman, I think I mentioned before, that he and his wife came in because their daughter had overdosed, and he, and we'll talk more about this next time when we talk about gender, but he would go out and garden And so it seemed like really task oriented. And so we're thinking, okay, he's like doing the yard. But what his wife didn't realize was that while he was out there gardening, because that's something that he and his daughter had always done together, he was like spending time with his daughter. And so he would talk to her while he was gardening, and he would cry and ask her questions about, what he could have done differently, and sort of just, it was his time where he felt like he could connect and talk with her. Even though he was doing a task, it was a connection that he had with her. And so finding those kinds of things that that maybe they did together that would have meaning for him at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Other questions? No? Okay. So listen, I think what we're going to do, because I think next week we are supposed to talk a little bit about gender differences, and we'll also talk a little bit about mediators of mourning. So we'll circle back to that and talk a little bit about mediators of mourning. We'll also talk a little bit about what complicated grief looks like. There's a PowerPoint that's up there for that. So we'll do those two things and then circle back to gender, and then we'll start talking about kids the following week. Okay, so thanks for being flexible, and hopefully some of your other classes, if you have more on Mondays, aren't going to make you drive down there in the snow, but who knows, maybe down in Baltimore it's not as bad. But anyway, if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. I think I'm going to do a little doodle poll, so there'll be a little link in the news section or announcement section, and I will put a sign up so that everybody can sign up. Just we'll let 3 or 4 people sign up for each week, and you can sign up. Make sure you write it down, and once everybody has responded to the doodle poll, I can do a PDF and put it up there so you can remember when you did it for your media presentations. Okay? All right, have a great week. If you need anything, don't hesitate to text me or email me. And if not, I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Before we hang up, is there any way that you had to document our participation or attendance?
I've written down all the folks that I'm seeing here, so
Okay.
I'll put it on there on the
Thank
gradebook.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Okay, thanks. And Ash CL is Ashley Claiborne. It's
Okay.
2 Ashleys in the class.
Yes, I see the CL.
Okay.
Good. Awesome.